I have heard this term Cold War being used to define what's happening today, or some people are even using the new Cold War as a term. And I fundamentally disagree with that term. I don't think that, like you said, it's a different environment today. And it requires taking off the old lens and putting on something new. So I don't know what the expression is, whether we call it the vertical world, whether we call it something else, but calling it the new Cold War doesn't give it the sense of urgency and doesn't give it the gravitas, the seriousness that it deserves. Just one example, at the height of the Cold War, at the height of the Soviet Union, the Soviet GDP was half of America's at the height, right? So the Soviet Union was never an economic superpower. It was simply a nuclear superpower. China, on the other hand, is on a path to overtaking the US. This is a completely different setup that we're entering. And just to build on this, what I said about China, it's again a sign of the metamorphosis, which is we have heard for years now, right, in the 2010s, that China will overtake America in the 2020s. Right? I remember reading 2024, 2027, 2028, China will be the world's largest economy. And this was kind of the poster, the headline, that if China overtakes America, then the US-led order is in decline. Right? That was kind of the assumption. Now, according to economists, China will overtake America in the 2040s. And China will then fall behind America again. So China will take over America for a very short time and then fall behind America. So just another example of how this metamorphosis is occurring. So what is the new environment? What are the central pillars? And there's a couple of central pillars. The first is that we are entering a world where no nation really calls the shots anymore. Right? That's the first new status quo that every nation in business is experiencing in their own way. That if you came from the West, you kind of had your pick of the fruits in the world. That doesn't exist anymore. You look at even small countries, Niger in Africa, right? Throwing out American troops, ending a deal with the US to have American troops, and then inviting Russian troops. Right? Wow, what a 180, what a reorientation of the country. Ghana in Africa, banning the export of raw resources like lithium on purpose because Ghana wants to draw foreign investment. And Ghana is saying, we're not going to allow the West to simply take our resources. We want the West to process those resources in our nation. So this is resource protectionism all over again, right? Starting off all over again. So number one, there is nobody calling the shots. US used to call the shots. That's not happening anymore. China is trying to call the shots. China is unable to get nations to follow it. You look at what happened when the president of China went to Europe, right? Or just 2 weeks ago. And what happened? He went to one country in Western Europe, France, and he signed no major deal. Right? All of the major deals that he signed was in Eastern Europe, Serbia and Hungary. Italy left the Belt and Road Initiative, right? BRI, a massive development for Italy. So no nation is calling the shots, and this is creating almost a Wild West-like environment in the world where nations are focusing on their own self-interest, their own trajectories, their own national desires, more than the common good, more than the collective good. Even in the West. And again, this is adding to the lack of leadership in the world. The second is that nations are prioritizing the reinforcement of borders, the reinforcement of their ideas and ideology and culture over the opposite. And the opposite was kind of what's been taking place for 70 years, more integration. Right? Let's get rid of barriers. Let's get rid of walls. Let's overcome the differences. And I'm not saying it was all good, by the way. I'm just sharing kind of the direction that the world was moving in. And it was more about let's integrate the economies and societies. Let's bolster connectivity. Now nations are saying, well, it's country first. It's America first. It's India first. It's it's France first, whatever it is. It's that the nation comes first, and this is causing a resurgence in sovereignty fights, in religion coming back to the center of societies, in questions of identity. And from this is a questioning of other aspects of the nation. What are we letting in the right people? Right, immigration. Are we aligned with the right countries? Right. So when Trump was president, there was a lot of questioning of the G7. Right, is the G7 still the club of the major world powers, or is it simply a club of has-beens? And that's why the U.S. wanted to add, India, Australia, South Korea, Japan. The G7 didn't want that. Countries in the G7 rejected that idea flat out because they wanted to maintain a certain environment. So this nation first is very important, and Europe is playing a very central role here. You look at what the French president has been saying now for almost 2 years, starting with his flight back from China last year, where he says on board the French presidential plane that France and European nations should not be vassal states of America. Right? He's being questioned whether France will help America in a war with China over Taiwan. And his response isn't yes, it's, well, we should have our own geopolitical strategy. We shouldn't be just following America blindly. And now Macron has been banging the drums of European sovereignty, or what he calls strategic autonomy, right? Building a strategic third pole alongside the US and China. That's a European pole. So Europe isn't dominated by the US or China. So that's number two. Number three, I would say, is that we're facing a new era of myriads of crises, right? Myriads of multiple crises are converging at the same time. So you have demographic challenges. I know Italy is facing a bit of a demographic challenge with the birth rate and the aging population. Greece is obviously well known, well documented. Germany is too. But the more known demographic crisis is in China. China is facing a massive demographic crisis, and this is eating into its ability to drive economic growth and thus build geopolitical power, because as the Chinese economy slows down, it's unable to keep up with its ambitions. Right, so this demographic crisis, Japan is another example of demographic crisis. And this is kind of a bit of a paradox, because at one moment you have a demographic crisis, say in Japan, that's driving the Japanese government to open up immigration. We're going to let in huge amounts of new people. But in other countries like the US, UK, Canada, even though these nations are experiencing a demographic crisis, aging population, it's no longer let's open up the gates, let's let everybody in. It's more, we're going to become more selective. So that's number was it number two, number three, and the last is that the role of technology is yet to be realized. When I wrote the book, The World is Vertical, I was wearing a different cap. I was working in a different company focused entirely on geopolitics and technology. And that's what I was doing for the better part of a decade. I wrote one of the first books on geopolitics and AI. I wrote one of the first books on geopolitics and tech. And at that time, when I was doing this work, it was very much technology was still in the R&D phase. It was still in the lab, or if it was being applied in the world, it was in very specific settings, right? Very controlled, very narrow settings. But now the cat's out of the bag, right? Technology is rapidly spreading around the world, and ChatGPT is an example. That it's not the only example. You have self-driving cars. You have China's goal with humanoid robots. Right? China wants to be the world leading exporter of humanoid robots, which is going to unleash massive geopolitical change. So technology is no longer just conceptual. It's really starting to move on the back of geopolitics in the most unexpected ways. You may have seen just last month, a company in the UAE, G42 is an AI company in the UAE. And last year or early this year, the CIA announced an investigation into them. The New York Times reported on this, that the CIA was investigating them because G42 was very close to China. And G42, as an AI company, was creating alarms in the US that this company was aligned with China, but was building a lot of partnerships with American companies. So the Americans were worried that this company was almost like a backdoor for China to access American technology. So when the report came out that the CIA was investigating G42, like almost within a week, switched sides. We are divesting from China. We are going to acquire American technology. We're going to align with the US. So the even in the technology space, the way in which technology is spreading is very much being driven by geopolitics, and it is having a compound effect, right? In this case, China is losing out because China is seeing the AI world pick sides with the US over China.